I need to begin with some acknowledgements. First of all, I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians of the country we're meeting on today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. Secondly, I want to dedicate this paper to my talented colleague, Enola Johnson, who died suddenly and much too young while I was away in London doing this research. Thirdly, I need to acknowledge the work of my research assistant, Sandra Bailey, and the financial support of the Wilson Foundation Charitable Trust and the Tasmanian State Library and Archives Trust, without any of whom this paper would not have been written. This project grew out of my research into the Allport Library's copy of the description of a voyage of certain ships of Holland into the East Indies. That volume is completed in facsimile, and I became interested in larger questions around that practice. How were facsimiles made? How common was the practice? How long did it continue? What effect did it have on the desirability of the book so completed? There are two main strands to my research: an examination of the records of the leading British bookseller Maggs Brothers, and an analysis of booksellers' catalogues from the late 19th through to the mid-20th century. The analysis of booksellers' catalogues is ongoing, and although some suggestive patterns are already emerging, it is too early to report in detail. The results of this analysis will be reported in another paper. Maggs records from 1914 through to 1978 are held in the British Library. I've been fortunate to be able to spend a block of weeks working through them. I took a slice approach, sampling files at intervals from 1914 through to 1950. I need to emphasise that it is only a sample, a few small slices of a vast archive. I've seen dozens of files out of thousands. This paper is my first attempt at digesting findings from that research. And let's see if I can work the technology. Oh, wrong way. Yes, right way. Next one. A little way into my time at the British Library, I opened a file that presented a startling apposite metaphor. On 30th September 1926, Liverpool businessman James Farry wrote to the eminent London booksellers Maggs Brothers, "I shall be greatly obliged if you can assist me in tracing an old story. An Eastern potentate had among his subjects some wise men of exceptional wisdom and some artificers of exceptional skill. Working together, they produced a bouquet of artificial flowers, so wonderful in texture, colour, perfume, and everything that a flower should have, that they regarded it as impossible to differentiate between them and the flowers they had imitated. Full of joy, therefore, they took the real and the artificial bouquets to their king, told them what they had done, and asked him which was which. He took a bouquet in each hand, and going to that corner of the palace gardens, which was under the care of the chief beekeeper, he planted them in one of the flower beds, where there was a vacant space. Soon the bees came and hovered around them both, but only into the flowers of one bouquet did they creep in search of honey. There, said the king, is your answer." Maggs evidently took this inquiry seriously. They promptly referred Mr. Farry to an eminent Orientalist, Norman Mosley Penzer. So it's just summed up facsimiles for me. But regardless, this letter is one among many that show how deeply Maggs' success as a bookseller was built on maintaining relationships with long-standing customers. He could have gone to the library. No, he decided to write to the bookseller. Before going further, I need to define some boundaries. This paper is about the practice of completing printed books in facsimile. It does not attempt to address the practice of repairing manuscripts by inking in missing or damaged letters. Obviously, these are related activities, but my focus is on the practice of reproducing a page or section of one copy of a printed book to complete another copy of that book. The practice of completing an original book with facsimiles is also obviously related to publishing a commercial reproduction, either of a complete work or of sample pages. Again, there are instances of facsimile publishing that shed light on the practice of completing in facsimile, but they're fundamentally different activities. Publishing a facsimile, whether of a printed or manuscript original, involves making multiple copies for commercial publication with all the attendant marketing and publicity. Completing in facsimile is generally done to one particular faulty copy. During the mid to late 19th century, facsimile leaves were usually made by hand, a process involving tracing another copy. During this time, it became increasingly common for publishers to use photography to create commercial reproductions of significant, interesting, or attractive old books. By the 1890s, such reproductions were being done to a very high standard. But one of the finest appears to have reproduced hand-drawn facsimiles. In 1897, the British Museum published a sumptuous volume of facsimiles of early printed books to accompany an exhibition in the King's Library. Its stated aim was, apart from the intrinsic beauty of many of the specimens reproduced, this publication will contribute to diffuse the knowledge and study of early typography by rendering accessible examples whose originals are only to be found in public libraries or the choicest private collections. Many of the leaves are reproduced in colour, and the introduction states that the facsimiles were executed by Mr. W. Griggs. And the hand-drawn facsimile has never gone away. In 1925, the typographer Stanley Morrison wrote disparagingly to Maggs about Mr. McMurtry's rather miserable attempt of facsimile of plant and specimen, an alarming work. In 1929, Maggs received an offer from an artist to complete books with hand-drawn facsimiles. If you have in your collection any early printed books which lack a page or two, I'm venturing to offer to restore in facsimile the missing page or pages. If the paper can be exactly matched, and this is usually the only real difficulty, the result is such as to escape detection by anything but the closest and most expert inspection. My charge for work of this kind is extremely moderate, being based on the time taken to accomplish it. All I ask is a trial and could not expect payment if you were not satisfied with the result. Well, the letter lacks an answered stamp, so they never responded to him. By this time, Maggs and the regular bookbinder Riviere had a well-established practice of commissioning facsimiles and an industrial process that delivered results superior to any but the most accomplished hand facsimilist. Correspondence throughout the files from the mid-1920s to the early 1950s show Maggs Brothers working consistently with Riviere & Son bookbinders and the Courier Press Leamington Spa printers and engravers. Other firms appear occasionally, but Riviere and the Courier Press were regular suppliers. No single document sets out the process in detail, but piecing together individual comments in various letters, a fairly clear picture emerges. Having established that a facsimile was required, Maggs would obtain a photograph from an original. The first port of call was usually the British Museum. If the British Museum was unable to supply, they'd look further afield, most often to the Bodleian. The photograph would then be given to the printer, who would make a block for printing. Maggs would then source paper matching as closely as possible the original. The book to be completed would also be delivered to the printer at this point, enabling the printer to ensure that the colour of the paper matched the original, or to dye it if necessary. Having the book in hand, and we're talking massively expensive, valuable 15th and 16th century books here, shipped off to the printer's works. Having the book in hand also enabled the printer to create a facsimile that perfectly matched the size of the original. The book with its new facsimile leaves would then go to the binder. So how did they establish that a facsimile was required? In what circumstances was completing in facsimile acceptable or even desirable? Consistently throughout the period from the mid-1920s to the early 1950s, when Maggs Brothers were offered a book completed in facsimile, they invariably rejected it. And for good reason. The records show multiple instances of buyers returning books because they've discovered an undeclared facsimile leaf. Even if a facsimile was difficult to detect and of an insignificant element, the aggrieved buyer could and would promptly return the book and expect a refund. The sums involved could be substantial, as when the Cambridge bookseller Heffer paid £86 for a first edition of Humphrey Clinker, and within a fortnight sought to return it on the grounds that the half titles of 2 volumes are in facsimile, and that the other appears to have been substituted from another edition. Heffer had purchased the book, presumably for a client of his own, at a Sotheby's sale. Maggs Brothers were liable because they had catalogued the books and they'd missed the facsimiles. Analysis of the catalogues of Maggs and other leading antiquarian dealers is so far tending to support the hypothesis that books completed in facsimile were becoming less attractive to wealthy collectors by the late 1920s and continued to decline in value over the following decades. And yet, what on earth? This eminent, long-established, widely respected bookseller was involved in actually completing books in facsimile. The pattern that emerges from the records is that mags would offer a recent or prospective purchaser the option to have an incomplete book completed in facsimile. In most instances, the book was exceedingly rare. So, a first edition of Humphrey Clinker might be rejected with reasonable confidence that another copy would appear. When, however, it was unlikely that another copy could be obtained, and the book was sought as much for its information content as its iconic status, the argument for completion became compelling. In 1951, Ken Maggs wrote to a client in Uruguay, "I've recently acquired a copy of the first edition of Buenos Aires Truth and Reason, Octavo 1807. I've had the second edition once in my lifetime, but this is the first time I've had the original issue. Unfortunately, the last page, which only contains a few words of print, is missing, and I'm having it replaced by an exact facsimile. In fact, I doubt the difference will be discernible." The facsimile was made by Courier Press. The process took a little over 2 months. The client pronounced himself pleased, but requested that the binding be not too expensive. I want to conclude with a starting point for another essay and reflect on the phenomenon of completing or perfecting printed books. Museums, of course, have long used replicas in their displays, both to protect precious original artifacts from exposure to wear and tear, and to represent, to illustrate, to instruct. But museums also display relics, ancient objects that offer a tangible connection with another time and instill a sense of wonder. The British Museum's display of the treasures found at Sutton Hoo includes a reconstruction of the shield, a replica that both improves understanding and enhances the wonder of the original artifacts displayed alongside it. Walking around the V&A on my first mildly jet-lagged afternoon in London, it struck me how many of their replicas, especially of medieval artifacts, have acquired such a patina of age that they now have the status of original artifacts themselves, albeit illustrating a different story from the one they were created to tell. In the same vein, the facsimile leaves in the Allport description of a voyage perform their original function of filling a gap in the text and also tell their own story. This is not to deny that paper is as important as ink, and that being able to place each element chronologically and geographically depends on being able to distinguish original elements from later interpolations. The forensic work being done on incunables at the John Rylands Library in Manchester is opening all manner of insights into the making and movement of books in early modern Europe. My point here is simply that every element of a book as we now have it, every accretion, every loss, is part of its history. There are so many situations in which a complete book is preferable to an incomplete one that the fastidious collector's horror of facsimiles is really quite odd. If you want a first edition of Humphrey Clinker because you're doing something productive with it, critical editions say, you can probably cope with a replica half-title. My starting point for this research was A.W. Pollard's remark in the 1911 Encyclopaedia Britannica that few collectors were educated enough to prefer copies in the condition in which the ravages of time have left them. And Iolo Williams' categorization in 1927 of the replacing of missing leaves of very rare books by facsimiles as a form of imperfection. Williams was writing when techniques for making facsimiles had developed to a point that it was a complex mechanical process capable of producing copies of such fidelity to the original that the question of their authenticity quickly becomes mired in abstruse philosophical arguments. Because wasn't the whole point of the printing press that it enabled the production of identical copies? One last thought before the bear comes to get me. Well, I could have said so much more. Yeah, we start. Okay. One last thought. Which is more desirable? Which more authentic? A facsimile drawn by hand or one produced by a complex industrial process? In the Treasures Gallery at the British Library, I saw many wonder-inducing objects, not least a first folio Shakespeare with the title page supplied in hand-drawn facsimile. Our hosts here today at the State Library of New South Wales will, of course, observe that their first folio is superior because it has an authentic printed title page. And of course, they're right. And yet in that imperfect British Library copy, there is a work of art executed hundreds of years ago, a loving attempt to complete a famous book.